My name is Mark Leier. I'm 68 years old. I'm living now in the city of North Vancouver. Ladner was a small town. Most of it, the work were people who were fishers and farming families originally. It was growing by the time that I was born, but it was very much a kind of isolated town and a very working class town. Both of my parents, by any description, would be members of the working class. My father operated heavy equipment, ultimately for the municipality, driving trucks and graders and all kinds of equipment. And my mother was a secretary. Right? The high school that I went to had at the time one of the lowest rates of students who went on to universities in the province of British Columbia. Right? So it was a place in which education for a long time had really been about the kind of 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And it was about giving people some very basic skills to continue as their parents and grandparents had. A lot of the families there have been there for a very long time. So working the family farm, working the family fish boat was a career path for a number of people. It was changing, it's growing, but when I was born, you had to actually take a ferry to get from this town across the river to then get into Vancouver, which was, the goal of many of us at a certain age. How do we get out of this place? By the time I was old enough to drive or get on the bus, there was a tunnel, but it was in some ways an isolated place. People often say people become leftists or socialists or anarchists because they want to create or at least envision a better world for their children. Right? I think for me, it was actually a sense of wishing there was a better world for my parents. The injuries of class, physical, emotional, psychological, were really evident to me. And it seemed that people that I knew, smart, intelligent people, lived lives that seemed in deep contrast to the stuff that we were being told was happening. So this was an era when television is beaming in all the great stuff that you should buy, and people tried to do that, and yet everybody seemed panicked, uh, angrier than they should be, or frustrated, or somehow not able to develop their obvious potential. And some of that tension was in the family, and it was at schools, um, and it seemed to me, even at a pretty young age, that this was a real conflict with all of the stuff that said this is the greatest society ever. We have the wealthiest, we've solved all of our problems, etc. Those issues, those conflicts, seem to get worse or more obvious as I got older. So by the time I was in grade 8 or 9, um, let's say I would have been in grade 8, I guess, at the time of the Kent State Massacre of 1970. And what that did for me was to say, all that stuff that I've learned, even in Canada, right, about democracy, about people, in the United States, which calls itself the greatest democracy, ever. If they're not lying, they're sure exaggerating, right? Because here is a country that is shooting down its own citizens who are engaged in peaceful protest. Right? So that for me was a kind of a drastic turning point. Um, and then I had a social studies class where we looked at the Industrial Revolution and all of the issues around that of child labor, of terrible working conditions, of ferocious repression. Seemed a lot like what was happening where I was many years, centuries, and many, many miles from that. And it seemed so that got me interested in questions around what I would describe now as socialism. And a school system that still used the strap on recalcitrant students. That is to say, was not a lot, but it was still there. British Columbia had a pretty right-wing government in power from 1952 to 1972, which meant that the school system was backward. It was pretty authoritarian. It was kind of, there were very good teachers in it, but teachers themselves were actively protesting. They were engaged in stuff. Uh, the university, I'll wind this down in a minute for you. The university where I'm presently working was created in 1964 and was a hotbed of the New Left. And so some of that percolated into my consciousness by 1970 as a junior high school student. And it was reflected in some of the teachers that I had. So as this little town is growing, is now becoming a big suburb of Vancouver, um, and teaching is now a desirable place to get a job. Teachers are coming there, and some of them trained in that hotbed of radicalism that was Simon Fraser University. It was all part of that kind of, that is, they were encouraging. I think another generation of teachers might have said, yeah, you're interested in socialism, go read Animal Farm until you get over it, right? You want to know about socialism, read Lord of the Flies, go read 1984, all the books which were mandatory parts of the curriculum at that point. These teachers said, yeah, you're right. Why don't you read this? So it was a confluence of all kinds of things, personal things that got me asking questions, and a particular moment where students and administrators themselves were interested in change. And in 1972, we elected a they're not a socialist government. They're barely a social democratic government, but they call themselves that. It's called the New Democratic Party. They've been around for a long time. The party started in the Depression of the 1930s, and they were elected in part with a mandate to reinvestigate, to reshape the education system. And so I benefited from some of the fallout from that too, for people where it becomes student-centered. At least that was the rhetoric, and so that was a big part of it. One of the things that this new democratic government, the NDP, did in its first couple of years was to create a commission on education, right, that was going to investigate every aspect of education in BC from kindergarten through high school. They understood that we needed a major shakeup. And in Canada, whenever we have a huge social problem, governments just create commissions to investigate it, okay? And then 10 years later, they issue a report, all right? And so this is a pretty standard tactic. But this one was kind of interesting, in part because the NDP had got a lot of support both in terms of money and volunteers from the teachers union. Um, and so they were a big factor. They were pushing, they'd promised educational reform. Um, and they hired a guy named John Bremer to head this commission. And Bremer was a British educational activist, pundit, thinker. He was actually working in Philadelphia, where he helped to create something called the Philadelphia School Without Walls. This didn't mean it didn't have a building. What it meant was that students would organize their classes. They would draw on experts to come and teach, and it would be very, very student-based, student-centered, and integrated into the community. Right? Um, so so I was at that point, my activism was about writing letters to members of parliament and to members of the provincial members of the legislative assembly, and I wrote one to the brand new minister of education, who wrote back to say, we're starting a commission. The minister of education. She wrote back to say, we are starting the commission of education. Do you want to be on it as a representative of high school students? And I said, yeah. Sure, this sounds great. Bremer was a fascinating man. He was, you probably know who Studs Terkel was. He was a American broadcaster, socialist. He had a long-running interview show in Chicago. And he interviewed Bremer around 1971 or so. And asked Bremer, what's the problem with education? He says, well, and he said in his very soft English voice, he said, well, every school in America has probably worked a long time to come up with its educational outcomes. Well, any idiot can produce educational outcomes, and I must tell you, many of them do. And is we have to start with the student. Right? What do students want? What are their capacities? Once we get them excited, they will learn anything. So he said, it's like maybe there's a student in our school who wants to learn how to fly a kite and make a kite. So we'll talk to somebody. We'll have them come in. And maybe that person will know a bit about engineering. And he'll tell them about the Bernoulli principle and why it is that kites stay up. And there's your science lesson. So this is what he brought to this. And I thought, and the way he opened this up was, I don't know that he would identify himself as an anarchist, although he was known by people like George Lakey and the new social movement people that Nathan has written about in Philadelphia at the time. So, there's just so much stuff going on there. But I don't know that he identified as an anarchist or even a socialist, but it doesn't matter because it's clearly building on what we would recognize as anarchist principles of pedagogy. So I was super excited. I was in way over my head because I knew nothing, and I was in all these meetings with ministers of education and commissioners and people from around the province. We traveled to province. And Bremer had this great way of saying things like, well, one of the things in our schools is that we have principals, and principals direct teachers. I wonder if we really need principals. And people shit themselves when he started saying things like that. The Association of BC Principals, Bremer must be fired, yada, yada, yada. So tons of controversy, even though he was just floating an idea. Do we really need attendance policies? Of course we do. How are we going to break people on the wheel of industrial discipline if we don't have late penalties and policies? So that was fun, and that was exciting. And then the government fired him. Right? So what that taught me as a sort of 16, 17-year-old a person involved in this big process of educational reform, at the end of the day, this so-called socialist government that had promised to do so much, at the end of the day would do whatever it took to stay in power. And if that meant silencing critics, if that meant silencing experiments, they would do that. And at that point, I started thinking about, okay, there's got to be something else going on here. I've read enough Animal Farm, not a Bolshevik, not a Trotskyist, not a Leninist, not interested in that stuff. Those and the people that I met, many of whom were my own age, they all seem just kind of mean-spirited. Right? There's got to be something else out there. And that slowly got me thinking about, I started reading other kinds of people, and that ultimately took me to thinking about anarchism. And for me, the summer after I graduated high school, I guess, I hitchhiked out to Toronto, where a friend of mine had moved, went to the University of Toronto bookstore, saw this book called The ABCs of Anarchist Communism by Alexander Berkman. I'm like, I don't know, sounds... I'll buy it. It was cheap. The books were like cheap those days, and minimum wage was much higher in relation to what things cost than it is today. I'll buy it, and instantly fell in love with it. Right? Somewhere in the book at the beginning, Bergman says something like, I want to tell you about anarchism because I think it's important you should know about it because I think it's one of the finest and best things that humans have ever created. And it's like, tell me more. So Bergman's, I knew nothing about Bergman except what the introduction had said. Okay, did 14 years in prison, etc. That little affair of trying to assassinate Henry Clay Frick. But the book just spoke to me in such a resounding and powerful way. And that took me to people like Peter Kropotkin. And I read The Conquest of Bread, and I thought, those, I didn't think this consciously at the time, but it was like he had put his finger on both of them, on the issues and problems that I had felt and could not articulate, even as a young kid growing up in this small town. And they said, and you know what? We can solve these problems. These aren't about human nature. It's not that we are just nasty, horrible, and therefore need the Leviathan of the state to keep us from slitting each other's throats, right? And Kropotkin, writing in the 1890s, said, we've solved the problem of scarcity. We don't need these kinds of arrangements if you're telling us that we have to just divvy this stuff up because we just can't feed everybody we've solved that problem. And it all made complete sense to me. And I will say, I expect, although I think this just occurred to me now, I think that my experience of mine of growing up in a farming and fishing town, though my parents were not farmers or fishers, there was evidence, that groups of people could actually feed themselves. Right, in direct kinds of ways that we could make this stuff work. It wasn't like I'd grown up somewhere where we're all just university professors who can't even figure out how to work the thermostat in our rooms. I grew up all people who knew how to do stuff. Right, this seemed eminently sensible to me, and then it was downhill from there. Right? One of the things that I did as part of this commission, we meet in downtown Vancouver. So first, yes, bus ride out of Latter, awesome, and it was near a Trotskyist bookstore called Vanguard Books. Didn't know it was a Trotskyist bookstore. They had neat political stuff there, and they had this very sweet looking. Looked like your grandma. I mean, I don't know your grandma, but she had these twinkling eyes and white hair, and she always looked like she just baked cookies, right? Oh, hi, come on in. How can? It turned out, I discovered years later that she was like one of the most ruthless political infighters within the Trotskyist movement. It was always purging people, and just a nasty infighter. But I had. Grown up in mostly in schools when folk music. I was like kind of I was in the early '60s. I was pretty young, but my hip music teachers were teaching us folk music stuff. So it was like Joan Baez and Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan, and not just the old songs of empire that we used to sing. I remember we literally sang one song that the British sang on their way to the Boer War. We are marching to Pretoria. It's like Jesus Christ. So I had kind of interest in the music, and then I heard there's a new Joan Baez album. And one of the songs on it was "I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night," the wobbly singer-songwriter martyr. So I heard the song, liked the album, went into the bookstore and said, "Look, who's this Joe Hill guy?" I said to the sweet Trotskyist grandmother. She goes, "Oh, you must buy this book." And it was Joyce Kornbluth's Rebel Voices, which was a collection of IWW songs, poetry, cartoons, and articles. That basically we would say that she cut and pasted. And it's a fabulous, fabulous book. You can still get it. And I just ate it up. I thought, so here are people who now, like me, after high school, are working, right? And they have this vision of democracy on the job, both as activists and as a possible future. So this IWW vision, plus the music, that seemed to me a great way to work with people, to bring people together, and to make a point. Joe Hill and others have said that, a great sermon is fine, a great pamphlet's great, but the minute it's over, it's gone. But a song will stick in people's heads and they can repeat it, and you can all do it together. Right? So this was in a way, an organizing model too. And I got a copy of the IWW newspaper, and I would have been about 19 or so then, and it listed all of the delegates where you could go and sign up to be, and there was one in Vancouver. So I called him up. It was my great, great fortune that he was also a musician. Who sang wobbly songs. He was a friend of Utah Phillips, you may know. It was an IWW troubadour, died about 10 years ago, I guess. And that got me wired into this. It got me wired into other wobblies in Vancouver, some of whom had been involved in the now defunct Student Left in the province, some of whom were working as radicals within more conservative trade unions here. So we were, um, to call it a study group, we didn't study that much, but we read, we talked, we were all working in places and helped each other think about organizing to try to bring a more militant, a more democratic, and a more radical vision to our workplaces. I've kind of liked David Graeber's little piece that says you might already be an anarchist. Like, do you think, when you get into a lineup somewhere, do you push other people out of the way, or do you think other people should? No, you might be an anarchist. Basically, kind of his line was, and if you excuse the language, if you're not an asshole, you're probably an anarchist, right? Now, I think that is a calculated naivete on his part, to bring people in. But I do think that a lot of anarchism is realizing and understanding that human nature is not set in stone. We are not victims of some human nature, that we are in some fashion both independent but also shaped by our circumstances. And when we create societies, and put it a different way, I've always liked the quote that Emma Goldman took from a criminologist that said, "A society gets the criminals it deserves." Right? We create the problems so we can uncreate them. And so by anarchism, I think I mean something that might be in more conventional political terms, a very strong form of democracy that extends into our personal lives and our workplaces. So if people say democracy is about a parliamentary or Westminster system, with two, I said that's not democracy. That's just a voting mechanism, and not a very good one if you want to represent people. But I would say if democracy is ruled by the people and people in groups making collective decisions on all the affairs that affect them, that to me seems pretty close to anarchism. I think it was Mussolini who said an anarchist is a fascist who hasn't figured out how to get power yet. You're wrong, Benny. That's not it, right? It's and there's an anarchistic thinker, interesting guy named Max Nomad, who had a line who had been involved with a kind of an offshoot of the anarchist movement in the 1920s in Europe, and then became this kind of anarcho-cynic critic, that just kind of basically said, whenever people get together, there's going to be oligarchy, kind of borrowed from Robert Mickle's, the iron law of oligarchy. There is no hope, but some of this stuff has been interesting, and so wrote several books about it. And his line was something like, a fascist is someone who treats adults like children. An anarchist is someone who treats children like adults, right? And I thought, yeah, that's not very good either as a definition here. So I do think of it as organized communities where the people there make decisions on the issues that affect them, and that includes the workplace. So no gods, no masters seems like if you had to put it on a button, that works for me.
All right, thank you so much for that. Could you tell me a little more about your kind of involvement and just your overall political trajectory
Yeah.
from this time to this day?
Okay. Right. Um, One of the things that I did as part of this commission, we meet in downtown Vancouver. So first, yes, bus ride out of Latter, awesome, and it was near a Trotskyist bookstore called Vanguard Books. Didn't know it was a Trotskyist bookstore. They had neat political stuff there, and they had this very sweet looking. They looked like your grandma. I mean, I don't know your grandma, but she had these twinkling eyes and white hair, and she always looked like she just baked cookies, right? Oh, hi, come on in. How can it turned out, I discovered years later that she was like one of the most ruthless political infighters within the Trotskyist movement. It was always purging people, and just a nasty infighter. But she and I had grown up mostly in schools. When folk music, I was like kind of I was in the early '60s. I was pretty young, but my hip music teachers were teaching us folk music stuff. So it was like Joan Baez and Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan, and not just the old songs of empire that we used to sing. I remember we literally sang one song that the British sang on their way to the Boer War. We are marching to Pretoria. It's like Jesus Christ. So I kind of interested in the music, and then I heard there's a new Joan Baez album. And one of the songs on it was "I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night," the wobbly singer songwriter martyr. So I heard the song, liked the album, went into the bookstore and said, "Look, who's this Joe Hill guy?" I said to the sweet Trotskyist grandmother. She goes, "Oh, you must buy this book." And it was Joyce Kornbluth's Rebel Voices, which was a collection of IWW songs, poetry, cartoons, and articles. That basically she just, we would say, she cut and pasted. And it's a fabulous, fabulous book. You can still get it. Um, and I just ate it up. I thought, so here are people who now, like me, after high school, are working, right? And they have this vision of democracy on the job, both as activists and as a possible future. So this IWW vision, plus the music, that seemed to me a great way to work with people, to bring people together, and to make a point. Joe Hill and others have said that, a great sermon is fine, a great pamphlet's great, but the minute it's over, it's gone. But a song will stick in people's heads and they can repeat it, and you can all do it together. Right? So this was, in a way, an organizing model too. And I got a copy of the IWW newspaper. And I would have been about 19 or so then. And it listed all of the delegates where you could go and sign up to be. And there was one in Vancouver. So I called him up. It was my great, great fortune that he was also a musician. Who sang wobbly songs. He was a friend of Utah Phillips, you may know. It was an IWW troubadour, died about 10 years ago, I guess. And that got me wired into this. It got me wired into other wobblies in Vancouver, some of whom had been involved in the now defunct Student Left in the province, some of whom were working as radicals within more conservative trade unions here. So we were, to call it a study group, we didn't study that much, but we read, we talked, we were all working in places and helped each other think about organizing to try to bring a more militant, a more democratic, and a more radical vision to our workplaces. First, I'd blame Alexander Berkman, I guess. That I found that just booked. I just something about it I just loved. I'm not sure what it was, but and but it was the idea that well, I guess part of it was some understanding of the reality of the Soviet Union. Right? The reality that even in a system that was very different from that, that is the politics in Canada and British Columbia, at the end of the day, the state would look after the state first, right? And it would kowtow to business, even if it was a so-called left state. Right? The other event that happened while I was in high school, of course, was the election of Salvador Allende and a socialist government in Chile, and the coup after that. And so that pushed me into thinking about politics at an international level, reading more stuff. A very interesting book called The Enemy, What Every American Should Know About Imperialism by a journalist named Felix Green. Again, kind of instrumental. That is to say, this stuff explained what I saw on the news and read in the papers in ways that the news and the newspapers were not interested in explaining. Right? So they pulled it back. And pulled back the curtain. That's the old Wizard of Oz reference. It's been done to death, but still, it's like, this is the reality. Take a look, right? And it was so obvious and so clear. It just made so much sense for reasons that I can't explain. Wrapped up in my, I don't know, my DNA, my psyche, my who knows, right? And a chance remark by a student or a teacher, I don't know. So it just made sense, and it seemed so logical and useful, and it just opened up the world in that sense. The anarchist part came not because I was that kind of a rebel that we often think young anarchists are. Yeah, I was not the kind that wanted to just yell and shout. In part because I think um, uh, for me that level of anger I found disquieting and difficult. Um, and in part, I don't know, this feels like, I feel like I should be paying you, doctor, for these therapy sessions. Uh, um, Quick example, I love playing football. All right. Really, really liked it. Probably just because I kind of liked hitting people, but it was in a controlled environment. But the last year that I played was a year that it was community football up to the age of about 16 or 17, which meant that we were starting to get scouted very, informally. There'd be some guy from the local pro team would come to a few games and look at it. And what that meant was people started figuring out ways to impress scouts, and that mostly meant ways to hurt people, not just hit people because that's the game, right? But figure out, okay, if a guy's giving you trouble, the coach would say, "Here's how you pop out his knee joint." And I thought, this isn't a game anymore. I'm out, and I don't want to be around people that are that angry, right? That are that prepared to go to the limit for self gain. And for me, that kind of took me out of all kinds of social circles and stuff. And it was just like, this is just nuts, right? Because take it from me, none of us are going to make it to the Canadian Football League, which is the equivalent of the NFL. So this is just nasty people who want to hurt each other. Kind of not a big fan of that. Right? So I think that's about a personality quirk. Who knows, right? Um, uh, so that kind of took me away from organizations that would say, say what you will about Lenin, but he knew what to do when things got tough. Yeah, he created the Cheka, and the first people they turned that on were the anarchists, right? So that to me seems kind of contradictory. I've never been a Hegelian in any sense, but that idea of that's a big contradiction, and I don't see a useful synthesis coming out of that. And again, lots of the Trotskyists that I met were young people who kind of liked the fact that they were hanging out with the kindly grandmother who was just a nasty political infighter. And that, you know. The other thing, I guess, for me too was, unlike a lot of them, I was working. So I worked for just about 10 years before I went back to university with the idea of becoming a teacher. And that meant for me, workplace struggles were pretty key. And it seemed to me pretty obvious that whatever we might conclude as anarchists about Marx, his idea about class and the working class, and obviously not his alone, made a great deal of sense. So then it became a question of, how do you organize people? How do you not just show up and yell at them or sell them T-shirts or try to sell them T-shirts or make them buy your stupid paper? I remember, one one Trotskyist group here was very proud of its monthly newspaper, and the headline one month was in huge type, "Smash Pabloism." I don't know what that means. You can't explain it. Why should everybody I'm working with care? Right? I don't know. So even their tactics seemed, at least, I mean, I didn't think about it in those terms then, but it seemed more like recruiting for Scientology, right, than it did trying to build a movement, right? Because they were all outside. They weren't in the workplace. They were trying to organize, and it's about, and the masses are stupid if they don't follow us. Well, as one of the masses, I didn't think I was that stupid, but so it just made sense. How do you work with people? Well, At that point, I'd read some Bakunin, and I liked what he had to say about this, that the role of intellectuals, which I would not have called myself at that point, but I did read a lot, uh, is not to tell the masses what to think, but to help them articulate what they're saying, to use those particular skills to help them and help them put together the ideas in a more systematic sense. And that just made sense to me. Right? If you're trying to build a new, better world, I don't see how that is an anarchist world, which even Marx would say, yes, this is what we're aiming for. And even Trotsky, I don't see how you do that by shooting people. So, except in self-defense, that's an entirely different question, of course. Right? At some point in the early mid 70s, the United States was launching, literally launching its new Trident submarines and its weapons. And so the peace movement had always been big here in British Columbia, and I was always kind of on the periphery of that in the environmental movement. Uh, as well as the other stuff, and Wobblies and anarchists had long been involved in this. So that was about protests, movements to oppose the Trident stuff, and some interesting people who did some good kind of training in peaceful civil disobedience. That again, I would say, as a reference point, like the kind of work oh shoot, the training for change people and the what is it, the Center for Nonviolent. I should know this off the top of my head. Um, doesn't matter. There's lots of groups like that, but that did some good training. And so hanging out with them, and again, the activism with the IWW, we were kind of a support group for other strikes. My wobbly delegate who signed me up, as I said, was a folk singer. I learned to play the banjo. We did a lot of work. Basically, we were kind of like you know, have banjo, will travel, would show up at picket lines, sometimes ask, sometimes not, attended demonstrations, and because we would sing all the old songs, we might write a couple of new songs, and did a lot of that kind of work as part of the support for stuff, as well as for me, it meant organizing. It was a unionized workplace, but as somebody once said, the IWW wants to organize the unorganized, but we also have to reorganize the misorganized. It was a very conservative craft union. Its leaders boasted they hadn't had a strike in 25 years. And it was like, yeah, and that's why this place we're in sucks, right? So helped to lead a really successful strike there. So that was a huge part of what I was doing. Great question. And I think it's a super important one. And I guess I would say that first, but only in terms of chronology, not necessarily importance. It serves as just a fundamental and obvious critique of hierarchy, of authoritarianism, and thus of capitalism and the state. And I'm not fond of quoting the Communist Party, but I did know a fellow named Homer Stevens, who was the Communist Party head of the Fishermen's Union here for several years. Went to school with his daughter, although I didn't know her well in high school. It wasn't I didn't learn lessons from him as a young person, but later. In his autobiography, somebody said, "So Homer, why the Communist Party? Like, what did it do for you as a union activist?" And he said, look, the upper issues the upper level issues that the party was interested in. Do we support this? Do we support that? In terms of wasn't what's our line today? Didn't much care about. But what the party did for me was to be a kind of a pole star, right? A way to say, okay, as I'm navigating this issue in front of me, right? How do I know I'm doing the right thing? Well, the vision of the Communist Party was a guide to that. And again, he meant that the vision that was shared by him and by other rank and file party activists, not in do we support Stalin, do we support this or that, but do we have a vision of a world in which workers are not oppressed, where we control the means of production, where scarcity is over and inequality is over and racism and sexism are just something we read about in history books. For him, that was one of the big functions of the party, yeah, just as a way to focus and to think, so how do I judge what I'm doing here? Right? And there's a group in Britain called Solidarity, and they did a lot of republishing of the works of Cornelius Castoriadis and Maurice Brinton, published a lot of stuff. And one of the things that in one of their early pamphlets that I had also glommed onto early from a different bookstore, not the Trotskyist one, but from a collective socialist bookstore, was, for us, what counts as good revolutionary action are things that increase people's, I think they probably said the masses, autonomy and self-understanding and self-mobilization. And to me, that anarchist vision serves a big part of that role. And for me now, it informs my pedagogy as a university professor to a huge degree. So for me, it serves part as critique, but also part of, well, if we're just doing stuff on a day-to-day level, how do we get a raise at this workplace? Well, there are lots of people who are not anarchists who do that work. They're usually paid extremely well for it, they're busy looking out for the working class so they can avoid being part of the working class. And the anarchist critique and perspective is to say, yeah, that's not helpful. Right? You just want to be the person that tells people what to do and when. All right, we got to mobilize and go on strike, and now you got to go back. Because I've gotten as much as I think I can get at the table. Right? So trade unions, not so democratic. But the anarchist critique of that provides, so it's a way of saying, is this helpful? Right? Does this move us in any tiny bit towards that goal here? I think too, it's a great way of cutting through so much bullshit. If you have some understanding of this, that that it functions in the way that others have said that Marxism might. I think anarchism actually gives us a better perspective. Although I'm not an anti-Marxist anarchist, some of the anarchists think I'm too much of a Marxist. Some of the Marxists think I'm too much of, it's a lonely life. And it offers, I think, real and possible and plausible alternatives as well, in terms of thinking big, asking the big questions, and guiding what we do in our day-to-day lives. I would correct your statement. The NDP for me, was more than a little underwhelming. It was absolutely devastating to believe, to see this in action and close up in the most, pragmatic, horrible, and the more I learned about them, the worse it got, right? So, then when I learned that Social Democrats in the Reichstag had voted for war credits in 1914, at that point, I was like, my line now is, I haven't trusted a social democrat since 1914, so don't get me started on this, right? But I have a kind of schizophrenic attitude towards electoralism, because I actually do think and have seen small things that changes in governments can do. Okay, so it's not a reason for me to become a party activist in the NDP. It's the fact that the NDP government would raise welfare rates in the province by not nearly enough, right? But by a little bit, to me, seems like a reason to vote for them. Right? This is a way of extending some kinds of solidarity to people who have no voice and no access, and we can make their lives in some small way better for taking 10 minutes to go out and vote. Right? So in that sense, I do not tell people, don't vote, it only encourages them. Right? Or if God had wanted us to vote, she'd have given us candidates. All of those anarchist slogans that I'm sure you've heard, right? And there's a great deal of truth in all of those. I don't deny it. But I do think that at a certain point, it becomes immoral if by some small action on our part, we can help alleviate pain and suffering among others. So that would be my response to that. Is it a reason to give them a lot of money? Nope. Is it a reason to become a party supporter? Nope. But I would not say that it is completely useless. And I would encourage anarchists to be more articulate about the real critique of it, to say, go out and vote. That's great. Now come back and let's do the real work. I guess I would say that, that for me, my a level of, I mean, I hesitate to call myself an anarchist, and the same reason that Ursula Le Guin did not like to call herself an anarchist. And she said, it's because I'm sitting here in my little house and I'm writing books, right? I'm not out there on the barricades. Right. And nor am I. I'm a lectern anarchist, I guess. I don't just mean that I yell at people to become anarchists, but my teaching methods and what I teach are deeply informed by this. But I'm not on the bleeding edge. I'm not on the point of the spear of the anarchist movement. I think that I do some good, and I hope so. But I would say that anarchism continues to inspire both my day-to-day relations with people, my political ideas and activism, and my teaching at a university. Right? One of the things that it means for me is that I happily teach large undergraduate classes, which most of my colleagues do not like to do. Right? Like they'd rather do the small, focused, high-pressure grad seminar, right? And they're great, they're fun, and I've had lots of great graduate students who've done, but any chance that I have to speak to 250 impressionable, questioning, eager young people to talk not explicitly about anarchism, but in ways to say, you tell me your boss at the coffee shop is a jerk. Why is that? Right? And explore that. This to me seems to be kind of important work. And it's important work because we've lost a lot of the old institutions that used to do some of this work. And by that, and again, they did it sometimes badly or weirdly, but as Noam Chomsky has noted, one thing about the Communist Party, they at least had a hall where you could go for a meeting, right? You knew where to find them, right? And we don't have much of that anymore, right? Union halls, most of them have security. Like you can't, like you can't get in to see anybody, let alone, have a meeting out there. They're not where people are. They're way out because, they sold their downtown buildings because they made a pile of money off it and then moved this tiny office that doesn't have a meeting room, right, off somewhere else. So because just another bureaucracy here. But thinking of that lack of institutions means that all of this information. So, I mean, I learned as much about socialism, and about Marxist capital and about anarchism by talking with people that I worked with. Right? Some of whom were working beside me in plants and places who had been part of the student left, right, but then had gotten real jobs after that. But my partner likes to talk about how she became interested in left politics, and she was working out of high school, just in a restaurant as a server, and she and the dishwasher, who was an older guy from France, would go out to have smoke breaks, right? And he would talk about politics. And he was like this left-wing kind of guy who was just talking about politics. And she went back and said to the manager of the restaurant, I've been talking to Jean-Claude, and he's got some really interesting ideas. And he said, "Oh, Annette, all dishwashers are communists." And I don't know if they're all communists. When I would call anarcho-communist is, I was one when I was washing dishes. But point is, I don't see that same chain of history, of information, of ideas being passed on through these institutions that have either become so bureaucratized or have ceased to exist anymore. Right? And just another story about that. I was doing some work with the Vancouver Labor Council, doing a history class for people, and they had just found in some little closet in the back of the office these flip charts from the 1950s, right? And they were printed, that they weren't ones that people had just written on. They had actually been produced and disseminated by the Mine Mill and Smelter Workers, which was a communist-led radical union. It had come from the Western Federation of Miners that had helped create the IWW, then became Mine Mill, taken over by communists. And this flip chart was all about demonstrating the labor theory of value. Right? So they would ship it out to the locals, and you'd give you a handbook, and you would say, "Okay, everybody, uh, I'm your shop steward, and today we're going to talk about grievances. But first, here's a little lesson on how we're exploited." And people looked at that and thought, "Holy shit! I need to know that now, and I need to tell everybody I work with this story. This is great." They don't do that anymore. Right? You're not that doesn't get passed on, and so it looks like for me anyway, at this point, the last best chance I have to talk to people about these ideas uh, is in big first year university courses, whether it's a course on the history of Canada or the history of capitalism, and this is deeply informed by everything we've talked about here, but that particularly that anarchist perspective. I think we can do better. And when people say, well, maybe, but I don't think we can get there. Oh, well, so we're at least agreed that we want to get there. Now we can have a debate about, but are we, so I think that anarchist organizing idea into my teaching. I'm not very good at it because it's really hard work, and I'm pretty lazy. And it's students, lots of students love it, and lots of students say, I just need credits because I got to get a diploma and I got to get a job. This is not helping. Others say, thank you for pushing me into an existential crisis. I wanted to go into marketing, and now I think that's evil. And what do I do now? so, so that for me, it's part of the challenge and part of and that makes it so exciting, and to be a very tangential and small, tiny piece in this long movement is a powerful feeling and a deep honor.